Hi, I'm Robert Williams, reporting for the Pride LA, and I'm sitting here today with Michaela Mendolsohn. And let me have you introduce yourself.
Oh, well, I think you already have. I'm Michaela Mendolsohn. I'm a transgender businesswoman and activist.
Cool.
And parent.
What is the California Transgender Workplace Program?
Okay, CTWP, which is our abbreviation, I founded about 2 years ago. Its mission is to promote California to be a truly trans-positive workplace, and then take California as a model and spread that across the country.
What motivates you to speak about transgender inequality and the need for workplace and income equality?
Well, in the workplace, I'm a business owner myself, and about 4 years ago we hired our first transgender employee, and she came to me with her story, which was she had worked at for another large franchise restaurant, and at that restaurant she was clearly identifying as a woman, but was told she must use the men's restroom. And she went to use the men's restroom one day, and there was another man in there. There was more than one stall, and she was sexually molested. She stayed at that job because she felt she had to. It was tough for her to get jobs, and so she was then told, yes, you can use the women's restroom, but only if there's nobody else there. So she would have another employee go, scout it out, tell her that back and say, okay, no one's in there, you can use the restroom. One day she went in to use the restroom, another woman came in behind her, went back and told her husband, there's someone in the bathroom who might be in the women's room who might be a man. The husband went to the manager and put enough pressure on that manager to fire her. Now, Christy is her name, came to me with the story, and unfortunately it was over a year after it had happened, because the laws in California were in place even then on this, but not too many people knew about them. I took her to one of the transgender law centers, and they said that it was past the statute, so unfortunately they weren't able to do anything with that. So that gave me, I should just say that incentivized me to want to do something. It took me a couple of years before I could really formulate the idea in my mind, and that's, in the last 6 months we've really taken on an active role.
I read that you do not believe Caitlyn Jenner is a good spokesperson for the transgender community. Can you explain that?
Well, I think Caitlyn would, I don't know if I actually say it exactly that way. I'd say she's not that she's not a good spokesperson. She's not ready to be a spokesperson, I think is a more accurate way to put it. I know Caitlyn, and I think she would agree that she's just still learning. So while she is a spokesperson, I think she realizes she's not ready to be the spokesperson. But in media and such, with her notoriety, she's been kind of thrust into that role.
When did you become aware you were transgender?
Well, I was born in 1952 in Bronx, New York, and grew up in Long Island, New York, back at a time when we didn't hear much about being transgender. Nothing really. I mean, I had no idea what that was as a child growing up. There were no talk shows like, Ellen DeGeneres talking about it, or Barbara Walters. There were no books on it. So, the feelings I had back then, I was just acting on it in different ways. I mean, there were obvious things about me that I liked having girls as friends and doing things with them, and I liked wearing my sister's clothes, but I did not understand what was happening, and I kept it mostly private because I didn't want to be ridiculed. So.
What was the process like to find self-acceptance?
Well, fast forward all the way, it's through bullying in my teens, and then in getting married and having 3 children, and putting all of my energy into raising 3 kids and wanting to give them, the love I didn't have as a child, and starting businesses, and I was into extreme sports, and I was really a jock at that time, so I had everything focused on keeping busy enough so I wouldn't think much about what was going on. But you can only suppress that so long. So when I hit about 50, it got so bad suppressing it that I was coming apart physically and emotionally. And so when I finally realized what I needed to do, and then it was more public and I could read about it and understand what I need to do to take care of myself, it was an amazing journey, but a difficult one because of having not only the social aspects, but as much as anything for me, the difficulty was in that I had 3 kids and a wife at the time.
And was there a moment that you can remember? I mean, I remember when I realized I was gay for the moment, and I just kind of had to like sit there and think, I'm going to have to accept this. Was there a moment like that for you, or was it over a period of time?
So all these years, I'm like acting it out in different ways, mostly in private, and compartmentalizing it in my head, saying, okay, now I can go on with my life, right, and stick it back. Until that one year, which I was falling apart and just hid out in my house basically for a year and ran my businesses through others. And one morning I woke up with a little voice that basically was saying, if you don't face your gender issues, you're not going to make it. And it was then that I ordered about a dozen books online from Amazon.com, and on every page I saw myself. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't insane. There was a word for it. I was transgender, and it gave me kind of a pathway to explore it and take care of finding out more about who I was. So, I was in denial, let's say, for all those years. Part of it because I didn't want to face it, and part of it because it was something that just wasn't talked about, so I wasn't exposed to it before. But once I started into specific gender therapy and got on hormones, female hormones, and my body and mind for the first time were agreeing with each other, then I really, the peace I felt made it really obvious to me. This is who I am. This is what I need to feel happy. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was walking up a steep hill every day of my life.
That must have been nice.
Yeah.
I was surprised to read that you didn't think that your transition was going to change the lives of your children.
Well, it was naive of me. I was used to kind of setting out visions and goals in my life and always achieving them. And so I just, visited child therapists. I read books about how to deal with it with my family. I met with other families who'd been through it. So I thought I had it all mapped out. But it's not so easy when you've got this image to your children, especially, that is one way, that they see you as this hero, this almost super, hero that they looked up to. That for my daughters, I was the man they would marry one day. For my son, I was the type of man he wanted to be one day. And when I came out to them, it was a huge blow. And so it took years for me to realize that they were losing more than I was at that point, because I was moving on to become my authentic self, and they were losing a part of their lives that had been so important to them, or they thought they were. It took a while for that to come back around.
And during that time, they didn't really want you to be around their friends or go to their school events?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was banished to my room when their friends were over. Sometimes I was upstairs in my room all day, because if it was a day off school or summer, I was told not to go to their schools, visit their teachers, their counselors, school events. So I was I guess they were embarrassed. They didn't know how to deal with it.
Did that make you question what you were doing at all?
Well, it made me feel awful. It made me at first a little bit angry that all the love that we were so close. Being a parent was the best part of my life, and I was angry that I wasn't getting back the love that I thought that I had given them. But it doesn't work that way, for a parent and a child. And they were going through what they had to go through. It got to its peak for me when one night I chose to go during my transition and not, unannounced to them and anonymously into my 13-year-old's classroom, and saw poems up on the walls of all the kids, and her poem was very painful to read.
It was. I have it right here.
Go ahead.
When I was 4 years old, I would sit on my daddy's shoulders and I was on top of the world. Nothing could hurt me. Now everything has changed. I'm no longer daddy's little girl. I'm no longer safe. Now even the sound of his voice sickens me. That makes me like emotional just to read that.
Thank you. It was like an arrow through my heart that night. And I had never been suicidal. I was always able to compartmentalize my pain up to that point. And then I realized that, at least I thought I realized, that my being alive was hurting my family too much. So I was not in my right mind when the following night I stepped out of my car in front of an oncoming car. And my then 19-year-old son jumped out of the passenger seat, grabbed me, and pulled me away, and looked in my eyes and said, "Dad, I don't care what gender you're in, this family needs you." And the next day I went to my therapist, and she said, if you think you're doing your family a favor by leaving them in that way, you've got it all wrong. That the worst thing you could possibly do to your family is commit suicide, because every day of their lives they'll wonder what they could have done differently to stop it. So since then I've never had another thought of suicide.
Mother's Day is close. You have a 2-year-old? Is it a 2-year-old?
2.5-year-old.
2.5-year-old.
Yeah.
Will you celebrate Mother's Day with your 2.5-year-old and your 3 adult grown children?
Well, this is how it works. My 3 adult children still call me Dad, because that's who they knew me as, and I want that relationship to still be comfortable for them. Of course, in public, they'll just call me Michaela or Michaela. But my 2.5-year-old, he's the light of my life right now. And I love it when I come home after a long day's work, or I go pick him up, like I will today at 5 o'clock from preschool, and as soon as he sees me, even if he's all the way on the other side of the building, he'll come screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy."
I bet that feels good.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
What is the greatest joy in having made your transition?
Well, that's a tough one, Robert. That's really tough. It took me, when I first transitioned, the interesting thing about it was I realized that I'd gone from one box into another, because, and I think a lot of trans women get into this trap, where all of a sudden, especially the late transitioners, as it's kind of called, those of us who are transitioning in 40s, 50s, and 60s, and all of a sudden, I was going to be living as the woman I thought I was my whole life, but I had a lifetime of living with the habits of a man, and doing a good job of it. And so I thought, well, gee, I've got to get everything perfect as a woman, know how to put on my makeup, do my hair, get dressed properly, speak properly, act properly, move properly. I mean, it goes on and on to try and meet all those perfect woman goals that we see, up on billboards or in magazines, and exercise and blah, blah, blah. And it was just one box into another. And then I would judge myself every time I had a thought about that was like I thought was too masculine, or wanted to do something that was too masculine. And once I realized that and really started working on myself in therapy and doing a lot of meditation, I've gotten to accept all parts of myself. And so it's a very different relationship I have with myself today than I've ever had. I really like myself now.
One thing I've always wondered is, in the process of your gender becoming more aligned with your identity,
right,
do you resent the parts that are sluggish to be on that journey with you?
I did, but no longer. Now I really, and I don't judge my thoughts anymore. I don't judge my actions anymore. Of course, I'll sometimes step back and say, you can do that a little better, but it has very little to do with gender anymore. I just am who I am. I think the term transgender will even eventually start to dissipate. I think that, like I said, I think that kind of creates another box. I work a lot with younger people, especially through the Trevor Project that I'm involved in. I'd love to speak a little bit about that. And a lot of them now are using the term gender nonconforming, and I think that's it's more progressive and more freeing.
You were the first transgender person to be named to the board of the Trevor Project, correct?
Yeah, but they have other trans people very involved, and they put tremendous efforts into that community for years and years now. So, but yes, I do feel a responsibility being transgender and on the board to really help them connect with that community and expand their services.
Are there any goals that you have specifically you want to talk about?
Well, of course, my workplace program, I really trying to pave the way for trans people in the workplace in California, especially in the lower economic segments, to have be on a level playing field and have more opportunity. Because all of this awareness that we're seeing in people like Caitlyn Jenner and Laverne Cox and on, really isn't trickling down to those lower segments of the community. There's more violence and more poverty and more bigotry for the lower segments of the transgender community than ever, and more suicide. So I'd love to see the day when trans people can be on a socioeconomic playing field, the same as the rest of society, and start broadening their vision. That's what I want to have something to do with, if I can. Start broadening their vision from living day to day, from worrying about survival, to just having a family. I mean, I feel so privileged to have two families right now, and I think that's the life that we should all be living.
Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner, they're both out there in the public. They're on magazine covers. They look like women.
Right.
Do you think that it's harder for someone who's transgender but who doesn't have the appearance of being as gender conforming?
By the way, I did the consulting for Laverne Cox's role in Orange is the New Black, but it is a difficult subject matter, and it's used often in our community called passing, a rite of passing. And for me, yes, it was important that I wanted to not stand out in a way that made life any more difficult for me than I'd had to be. But I never hide who I am. I never try to pass myself off as anything but who I am. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of women out there, trans women, who don't have the money they would need to have the surgeries that a Caitlyn or Laverne would be able to have. And that's just, they're my real heroes, because these women are out there every day living their authentic lives, and dealing with it in a way that's truly inside of themselves, that they don't, where they get to a place where they don't have to think about as much about how do I look, but how do I feel. And I think that's the ultimate goal. You,
as you said, you were a consultant for Orange is the New Black,
right,
for the Laverne Cox character.
Right.
Was there a message or a story that you wanted to convey that was important to you?
Well, I worked with Jen G. Cohen and her writers, and specifically the writer that was assigned to the role, the backstory of the role. And basically what I told them is, I don't want any credits or anything financially from this. What I'd like is two things, and of course Genji in her position is going to do whatever she wants, but to her credit, she did all the right things. And the two things I asked were, get the role right, because so many roles in Hollywood had been so stereotyped and so negative about trans people, and I asked that she hire a transgender actress, which she did in Laverne. So I think that was Laverne eventually showed up on the cover of Time magazine. They call it the transgender tipping point. And so I think Genji and Laverne should be proud of, what they've been a part of.
You talked about being a jock prior to your transition and
Right.
being into extreme sports. Have your hobbies and interests changed along with your transition?
Well, I stopped playing. At my age, there aren't a lot of rough and tough sports you can play, but I stopped playing softball, which was the last sport I was like involved in every week, for about 7 years after my transition, because I was, dealing with it's not so feminine anymore to be in sports. But then I went back a year ago to join a co-ed team in Thousand Oaks, California, and I love the look on the guys' faces when I hit it over their head and cross home plate.
Yeah, I bet. You definitely hit it farther than I could. What is the most offensive thing someone has asked you?
Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm such an open book these days that I don't take offense very easily. I don't like being misgendered. I guess that's just a touchy. It's a trigger point for most trans people, and I'd like to say that to all those who are watching this or listening, that that you can really be respectful of trans people. It's almost always very obvious what they're presenting themselves as, and by gendering them properly with the proper pronouns and the proper names, and you're really respecting them and helping them feel more affirmed about who they are, and that's really important. People, the trigger points for trans people, and 41% of trans people historically have attempted suicide, and a lot of that has to do with there's so many trigger points in society that make it difficult for them.
I spoke to several people about doing this interview, and one thing that was a kind of a common thing with what they said is that a lot of them are afraid to talk to trans people because they are afraid to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And how can we bridge the need to be respectful of the words that we use with also having an environment of openness so that we can get to know one another?
If you're talking to a trans person, I think it's fair to say, especially if it's somewhat new to you or not something that's common for you and you're worried about what you're going to say, I think you can say something like, I don't know, I haven't met too many trans people, so please excuse me if I don't always act or say the appropriate things, and I'd love it if you can educate me if I don't. And that will go a long ways. That will just diffuse any of those trigger points.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Robert.